to John chapter 6.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to the crowd, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Then the Jews began to complain about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I've come down from heaven? Jesus answered them, do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me. And I will raise that person up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I invite you to be seated. Jesus had this great way of walking into a room and irritating people. He didn't care very much. He simply said what was on his mind, and we know where that ended for him. But he didn't care. He didn't care because his eyes weren't on the people and how excited or angry, how much they loved what he said, or how much they were really annoyed by what he said. Instead, his focus was on what he was there to say. And so today, in the reading, he is there to explain to this crowd that had gathered because they heard what he did just before. They heard that he took a few loaves and fish and fed thousands, and so they start coming around. They start coming around because, after all, who wouldn't want the unlimited meal plan for free if you're a Texas State student? And so Jesus realized he had to explain something about what had happened. He had to explain that he wasn't just going to be the unlimited meal plan person, but instead that there was something bigger that had brought him there. He had to introduce himself for real. How do you introduce yourself? How do you introduce yourself at that first meeting? One of the interesting ones is when you get onto the airplane and realize you're going to be shoved in like sardines in this little metal tube for a good while. And the person next to you is not doing what a lot of us do and finding some way to appear very, very busy about something very, very important, whether it's real or not. But when that person turns, and you can tell right away they want to engage you. Those quick questions. How do you fill your time? Where are you headed today? Where are you from? Then there are the other questions. The ones that you get when you happen to be a pastor doing an interview or something like that. That fun one. Tell us something about yourself. And I really, really, really had to restrain myself not to say, I like to fish. I think I actually might have. I'm not sure. People want to get an idea of who you are. And Jesus realized right away that some of the people there that morning had gotten perhaps a different idea than he really wanted them to hang on to long term. And so he's going to have to explain himself a little differently. And then when he does, all of a sudden they pile on. The Jews, as it comes in here, is not all of the Jews. It's the ones who didn't believe in him and really should be listed there as the Jewish leaders, the ones who had a political honor to uphold. All of a sudden, this Jesus is showing up, and more people are starting to listen to him than listen to them, and they know that they don't need someone starting problems. And so they start listening really closely, not because they really want to hear what he has to say, but they want to figure out how to catch him. What's interesting, though, is this complaint is spot on. Jesus, from outward appearance, has no business claiming what he's claiming. He has no reason to do that. It's exactly what you might hear when some young kid gets in the face of an adult. Wait just 1 minute. Isn't this so-and-so's kid? And then there's basically the newer translation I would use. Who do you think you are? Now notice, it's very different than, what do you do with your days? Who do you think you are means you've already irritated the heck out of somebody. Who do you think you are means you're about to get told who you are, and it's not going to be kind. But he's spot on, these leaders, because this is Joseph's son, the carpenter's kid. And now he's coming in, this kid who's been pretty unremarkable. After all we know is these little excerpts from the very beginning. He showed up at the temple when he was 12 and had an interesting theological discussion, but then we hear nothing else for another 18 years. So my assumption is, if there was anything remarkable about Jesus up until he was 30, they would have written it down. We would have remembered it. It'd be somewhere in there. So up until now, this carpenter kid has been maybe a little interesting, but not that remarkable. And now he says he's here from heaven, when really we know he's here from the block over there where Mary and Joseph live. Who do you think you are? One of the most brilliant people I ever met. The first time I met him, I was pretty sure he was probably from the nursing home or the retirement center not far from the seminary, because he was wearing the old man jumpsuit, and he was carrying a bag, and he was opening up the recycling cans in the seminary basement and tossing the aluminum cans into it and wandering on along. And I said hello to him, and he kind of grunted at me. And I thought, probably one of the retirement people. Maybe he comes through here and picks up the cans for a little pocket money. I had no idea I had just met my advisor. I had no idea I had just met a man whose PhD was from the most difficult divinity school in the United States. On Kierkegaard, who, if you ever really, really want your brain to be scrambled like an egg, read Kierkegaard. A man who would impact my life in more ways than I could even imagine. No, I, first impression, thought he was probably an old man from around the corner who'd gone around the bend a time or two and was just picking up some pocket money in the basement. Just like those leaders, I almost missed what was happening in front of me. It wasn't until the next day when I went and met him in his office and realized, yes, the man had gone around the bend, but not out of dementia or anything, just because he was so far beyond us, he left most of us behind. But I almost missed it. Anyone could have missed it. In fact, had I not gone to his office the next day, I would have had no clue until the middle of second year when I actually had him for a class. The translation that I really have come to love of the Bible is the Message. It twists the words and puts them in an unfamiliar way that tends to smack you upside the head at moments. The way it translates miracles is really awesome. It's called God signs. One word with a little hyphen, God signs. It's a reminder that the miracles aren't there just to impress. The miracles are there. Jesus does these things not to be the bread guy. He does them so you can see that God is working here. The crowd had seen that something was happening, and so they came, and he has to explain that it's not about the bread, it's about a God sign. I wonder, just like I nearly missed Dr. Elhard, how many God signs we miss because we have a certain idea of what God is and what God does and where God is and where God is not. And that's what was happening in this story. You see, these guys were the religious leaders, and they were very sure that they worked for God and they did what God said, and anyone else who said otherwise was not God and not of God. Turns out they're actually pretty afraid. There are a lot of God signs that we miss because we are very sure of where we think God's at. There was a famous violinist who was coming out of Hamburg, Germany, named Fritz Kreisler. His boat was about to sail in 1 hour, and so he was walking around, wandered into a music shop, and was talking with the owner as he looked over things. And the owner said, "If you don't mind, let me look at the violin." And he opened his case, and there was a priceless instrument. The owner said, "Oh, wow," and made some excuse to head into the back of the shop. Came back just a couple of minutes later with 2 policemen who immediately informed him that he was under arrest. Chrysler, of course, said, "What for?" And the owner said, "Because you've stolen Fritz Chrysler's violin." He said, "I couldn't have. I'm him." And of course the police said, "You can't pull that on us. Fritz Chrysler doesn't walk around just wandering into random music shops. Come on." He explained that his boat was leaving soon and that he had to get to England for a concert. And so he set down his case, opened it up, and began to play. It wasn't until they paid attention and he asked, "Are you satisfied?" that they were. The question is, what if they're never told? What if it never comes so in our face? What if we never pay attention to that God sign? What kind of God signs do we miss because we know that certain people aren't the way God works? We know that certain colors of people tend to be certain ways, and we miss the God sign. We know that a young person can't speak truth, especially if they disagree with the older person, because after all, who knows best? We know that the more education you have, the more God sign you can do. We know that the pastor knows best. We miss the God sign. We miss the God sign because we forget what it's all about. But then we also miss the reality that each of us are God's sign. There's a story of a farmer who was out in the woods one day and found a baby eaglet who had fallen from the nest. He sent and got some water, but no mother eagle ever came. And so he took the eagle back to the farm and put it in with the chickens, thinking that it would grow and eventually would make it and fly off. But the eagle never did. It just continued to live there among the chickens, even though it was clearly not home. One day, an extension person came by and said, "Do you know there's an eagle about to eat your chickens?" And the guy said, "Not going to eat the chickens. It thinks it's one of them." And the naturalist said, "Yeah, but you can't keep one in captivity. If it's not captive, it can fly away." So the naturalist went up and picked up the eagle and said, "You were an eagle. You don't belong on the ground. You belong to the sky. Go." And lifted the eagle up, and the eagle took one flap of the wings, landed back down, and started scratching in the dirt. The naturalist said, "Well, all right, let's try the next thing," and climbed up onto the roof of the barn with the eagle. Said again, "You belong to the sky. You are an eagle. Go. Belong to the sky." And the eagle looked around and looked down at the chicken yard. Two flaps of the wings, landed back and began to scratch at the dirt. So a third time, finally, scooped up the eagle, carried it to the top of the cliff, raised the eagle up as high as he could and said, "You belong to the sky. Be what you are." And finally, the eagle took two flaps of the wings, felt the lift of the air, and became what it was called to be. It might be that the eagle still remembers the chickens, and I imagine maybe it would come back to visit its friends. But once we get lifted up to what we're called to be, we're changed. In the waters of baptism, we aren't what we were. The hard part is, more often than not, the church has spent its time letting us know what we're not. Letting us know what we're not allowed to do or be. Letting us know what we shouldn't say. When in reality, the church is there to remind us what we are. To remind us that the dreams are good. Too often the church takes exactly like the church people, Jewish leaders did, and said, "How can you claim to speak for God? After all, you are the teacher's kid, or you are from that part of town." When in reality, what the church needs to say is, you are a child of God. You belong to the world. You have a purpose, and it's not scratching in the dirt. You are going to be something special, the church needs to say. Not just to the kids, to every single one of us. Too often the church goes the route of these Pharisees and reminds us what we're not. Jesus, it turns out, was just a carpenter's kid. But Jesus was so much more than that. Jesus was the bread of life. Jesus was the essential for all time. Now, there is a danger to being what you're called to be. To being the eagle that flies when other people would rather you be a chicken. For Jesus, the danger was he ended up on a cross. But at the end, God says, better end up on a cross for being what you're called to be than end up in the dirt and never being anything else. There is a risk to being what you're called to be. And yet, there's a greater risk to never being it.